Hello, good afternoon. My name is George Heslin and I serve as Executive Director here at New York Irish Centre. On behalf of the staff and the Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you to the American Ireland Youth Conference 2023, Creating Waves. In creating this conference, I would like to thank the Irish Government and the Northern Ireland Bureau for their kind support. I would also like to thank our media partner, Irish Central. I would like to thank the conference producers, Hannah Cecil and Ryan McNally. I would also like to welcome students from 12 universities on both sides of the Atlantic, and to thank our moderators who have given their time to this excellent conference. You're very welcome to this three-day event. Please enjoy, and I would now like to welcome Irish Consul General from New York, Ms. Jelena Nolan.
Good morning and welcome to everyone participating in this second annual America-Ireland Youth Conference 2023, Creating Waves. My name is Jelena Nolan. I'm the Consul General of Ireland here in New York, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. I've reviewed your programme and I'm struck by the thoughtfulness that's gone into the selection of these vital topics and timely issues. None of these challenges are going to be resolved easily or quickly. Only by listening to all perspectives and by sharing best practices will we arrive at impactful responses. And that's where your participation comes in. You're gathered for this conference because of your exceptional expertise and insights. As advocates, educators and policymakers, you're all undertaking important work to identify and promote effective solutions to these challenges. This America-Ireland Youth Conference offers the hope of synergy, the potential to multiply the impact of your efforts by sharing your experiences and by learning from one another. This weekend is also about connecting people to one another to form partnerships and friendships that will endure well beyond this conference. So we count on you as young leaders to build on the transatlantic partnership between Ireland and the United States at this pivotal moment. I'd like to especially acknowledge George Heslin for his vision in first organising this event 1 year ago and for spearheading it into its second year, and Ryan McNally for his role as the conference's producer. Thank you. I wish you all the best of luck in your efforts and your work this weekend, and I want to thank all those involved in making this year's America-Ireland Youth Conference a reality. Buin sult as an accord speisialta seo. Gur míle maith.
I'm Andrew Elliott, Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau here in Washington, D.C., sending greetings to all of you that are involved in the America-Ireland Youth Conference 2023. What a fantastic event, what a great opportunity it is to connect across the Atlantic, and I was so pleased to see many of the Bureau's partner organisations involved: Queen's University Belfast, Ulster University, the Washington Ireland Programme, Mitchell Scholars and many more. Fantastic to be able to support this event alongside the Government of Ireland and other supporters, and wish everyone well as you debate and discuss all the really interesting issues, such as the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, reproductive rights and climate change. Have a great time, everyone. Enjoy.
Welcome to day one of the second annual America-Ireland Youth Conference, Creating Waves. We are your conference coordinators, Hannah Cecil
and Ryan McNally. This weekend, our young panelists will be tackling urgent and global topics. Today's panel discussion is climate change and poverty. Who foots the bill?
For years, global warming has been sold as a faraway problem of melting ice caps and polar bears. But increasingly extreme natural disasters and record temperatures have finally made us aware that climate change is here.
Low-income communities and developing nations are especially affected by our changing climate due to increased exposure, vulnerability, and food insecurity. But what does this mean exactly, and how can we help?
Here to moderate today's panel discussion is World Bank's Senior Energy Consultant and Climate Change Specialist, Ahmad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this first day and first session of the America-Ireland Youth Conference. It's my real pleasure to be part of this conference and particularly to moderate today's discussion on climate change and poverty and climate change and social inequalities, a topic that is not only very close to my heart, since I was a student, but also it's a topic that I work on a daily basis at the World Bank. I think we have a great and rich discussion today, and we have a great panelist to introduce. But perhaps first allow me to share with you some of my reflections on today's panel and hopefully use them as a starting points of discussion today. I think 2 years ago, the World Bank released a report that estimated by the end of this decade, around 100 million people will be pushed into poverty by climate change. Year after year, our knowledge is expanding on the impacts of climate change and how these impacts are affecting not only countries, but also vulnerable social groups within these countries. There are 3 levels of impacts that one can think of when it comes to the intersection between climate change and vulnerable groups. The first one, vulnerable groups often work in sectors that are highly impacted by climate change. One important sector is agriculture, and we see a lot of low-income countries, such as countries in Africa, they use agriculture not only as a main economic activity, but also a main lever for generating livelihoods and income. And agriculture is one of these sectors that are highly vulnerable to climate change in terms of the impact of heat on agricultural yield, the impact of reducing water scarcity, and also the impact of extreme weather events. Another aspect or intersection between climate change and vulnerable groups is the vulnerability of these groups to extreme weather events. Not only because they are living or they are living in areas or dwellings that are highly vulnerable to these impacts, such as informal dwellings for refugees, but also because of their low adaptive capacity to deal with these impacts. And one example to highlight here is the tragic floods in Pakistan that happened last year, which our early estimates indicate a rise in poverty between 5 to 7 percentage points. And Pakistan is a country of over 200 million people population. So we see like a large impact of climate change. So clearly the discussion is multidimensional when it comes to discussing climate change and inequality or injustice. One can look at it from a different perspective. I focused mostly on the social side, but also there is a global political side about responsibilities as well. But I think to reflect this discussion, and I hearing myself, I think I might have started with a dark introduction, but sadly, this is the reality of our situation. However, if there is any hope to tackle the climate challenge, the hope comes from the youth. And today, I'm really happy to introduce 4 amazing young voices who are not only passionate about climate change, but also they are leading within their communities a lot of impressive climate work to share with us their experiences and ideas. First, please allow me to welcome Jelena Collins, who is currently at McGill University studying atmospheric science. Welcome, Jelena, to the discussion. It would be great if you can start by telling us about your work, your experience, and your studies.
Hi, Ali. Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to be here. I was also here last year, so it's fun to be back. I've been doing environmental work since I was about 13 or 14, which is pretty young. I'm 18 now, so I'm pretty deeply ingrained in the subject. I started out on a kind of small local scale, which eventually grew to me in the city of Chicago, where I live now, helping bring together youth environmentalists from different high schools, since I was doing most of my work while I was in high school. But through that, I was kind of introduced to the world of climate policy a little bit more. So I was lucky enough to be the only high schooler who helped co-write Chicago's climate action plan, which was like Chicago's most recent climate legislation. And I also got to go to COP26 in Glasgow and speak there. I spoke at a UN climate conference as well in Montreal. And yeah, I've done a lot of policy work, a lot of work with youth engagement, and I'm very excited to be here now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. And next, please allow me to welcome Eoin Cummings, who is in his final year undergraduate studies in politics from Queen's University in Belfast. Hi, Eoin. Please also, it would be great if you can share with us more about your background and studies and how it interacts with climate change.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As you can see, I'm coming from a very sunny Belfast this evening, not like us. But yes, thank you so much for the invite, and it's really lovely to be here. Like Ali said, my name's Eoin Cummings. I've just completed my final year at Queen's University Belfast studying politics, and I'll hopefully be studying an M.Sc in climate change in September, also at Queen's. I am also the president of the Queen's University Belfast Politics Society since, I believe, November 2021, so coming up on 2 years now, which is quite nice. During my time there, I focused on increasing youth participation within Northern Ireland and specifically at Queen's University, and bringing sort of climate change to the fore of that as it's become more part of my life and what I've done academically and in my free time. We have over 300 members, so it's quite an effective way to sort of get a message out there and try and get people involved. Specifically with regards to climate change, I have to say, I was a bit of a pessimist. Whenever I was younger, whenever I was 16 and 17, that was sort of the height of the Fridays for Future protests. And I have to say, I did not go to one of them, much to my disappointment in myself now. But I sort of felt quite pessimistic about the future and maybe what I could do about it. But since I've gone to university and engaged with more people, I've really felt that there's a lot more hope and a lot that I can actually do. During that time, academically wise, I've focused on things like solar punk, rewilding, degrowth, and just transitions in my work. And as in my role as president of the Politics Society, I've gone up to Stormont to engage with the Green MLAs who sit there, sadly not anymore, but I work with them on climate issues, and we've also had information sessions. We've had politicians in, activists in, sort of holding them to account and to get new ideas. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eoin. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Amelia Medved, who just graduated from Fordham University in the Bronx. Amelia, welcome to the discussion. Also, please share with us your background experiences about climate change and the work that you do.
Of course. Super happy to be here today and to speak about these, essential issues. For me, I guess I entered the world of climate activism at a more global scale. I'd always been interested in, wildlife and ecology as like a very young child, but spent a summer while I was in high school at a pre-college program doing sustainable development coursework at St. Andrews in Scotland, where I was kind of with classmates from all over the world. And that really launched a lot of interest for me in climate strikes, direct political activism, and things like that, which kind of transitioned when I went to Fordham University for undergraduate into a much more than like locally focused interest in a lot of grassroots activism, community advocacy, and relationship building. And then local ecology and ecological history as well. We were, based in the Bronx, and I did a lot of work with Fordham's Center for Community Engaged Learning, which has great community partners doing very, very local environmental justice work, which I took a great interest in. I also did a semester while I was an undergraduate because I was focused on architecture. I did a semester at the University College Dublin in their School of Architecture, Urban Design, and Environmental Policy. So as I've kind of grown academically, I've kind of integrated an interest in architecture and design with, my environment and climate interests. And I'll actually be starting soon a job as a studio assistant for a landscape architecture firm in Manhattan. So I've been able to kind of combine these passions of mine and, do what I would like to do with a constant environmental lens, an environmental justice lens specifically. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Amelia. And our final panelist is Jack O'Connor. I'm pleased to introduce him. Jack is currently at the Center for Sustainable Future and Innovation at the University of Limerick. Welcome, Jack. Please.
Hi, Ali. Perfect. Thank you so much. It's delighted to be here, folks. First and foremost, as Ali very kindly mentioned, my name is Jack, and I work in the Centre for Sustainable Futures and Innovation at the University of Limerick, which is in the Midwest of Ireland. It's a brand new centre established in September of last year. So part of that is really trying to understand what are the long-term impacts that a higher education institute such as the University of Limerick must do to not only make a just transition towards climate change, but also build capacity of their students. And that's my role. I'm currently functioning as the Student Sustainability Coordinator, and my task is to develop the student program, understanding not only how can you instill confidence and skill set of a student to help combat, all 17 SDGs, not just the environment, but obviously climate change in particular, but as well as that, develop a shared understanding and a sense of community that you can do more work as a student when you work together, and that you can focus on issues, whether that's locally, regionally, nationally, or in our case, internationally. So very happy to be here and excited for a good, engaging panel.
Great, fantastic. I think when I first saw your backgrounds, when I first read your backgrounds, I was really struck by not only the diversity of the work that you do, but also the commonalities. I think all of you are social innovators. And what was really impressive for me is that all of you, you work with grassroots movements, you work on the global level, so in the local level. Of course, some of you have global exposure, and we will come back to that later. But all of you start with, making an impact on the local level. And maybe let me use that to pivot to our first question about trying to understand to humanize the impacts of climate change. I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have this cliche sentence that climate change disproportionately impacts vulnerable groups or poorer groups, which of course the evidence behind that statement is overwhelming. But at the same time, I find it too generic, right? Like, who are these vulnerable groups, and in what channels does climate change impact those groups? Also, at the same time, we at the World Bank, we always use GDP numbers, like climate change will impact this country by this year by X% of GDP. Again, like, this is a very average number. It doesn't trickle down into the realities of people. But since you've worked closely with these communities on the local and the global level as well, I was wondering if you can bring, all of you, if you can bring some of the stories, some of the examples that you have seen, try to humanize these impacts and share them with us and our audience online. So Jelena, if I may start with you.
Yeah, sure. I have two thoughts actually that came to mind when you were talking about that. One sort of interesting thing is that I am indeed studying atmospheric science. So it's a much more like mathematical and physical approach to the work that we've all been doing. And one of the things that stuck out to me in one of my classes that I was learning this year is how Bangladesh as a country is affected disproportionately by like monsoons and typhoons. And it's really, I don't know, it's fascinating, at least for me, to think about these things, because that is like, I won't go too deep into the science of it, but there are scientific reasons why certain places are being disproportionately affected by severe weather, which is in turn, of course, affected by climate change and global warming. And so those are people that, just because of geographic bad luck, are inevitably going to be more badly affected by climate change in the future. And also because they're like, this is very technical, but because they're sort of their seabed is very like flatness sort of extends very far deep into Bangladesh. It means that they're also more prone to flooding. So there are just sort of interesting, like, I guess, scientific aspects to what you were saying about different people being disproportionately affected by climate change. But the other thing that I thought of on a more local level is I am very lucky to live in Chicago in a neighborhood which is filled with trees. It's actually I think one of the state's only municipal arboretums. So it's like we have like enough tree diversity, I guess, to establish us as an arboretum. But I live right next to a neighborhood that has significantly less funding and significantly fewer trees, which in turn means that their air quality is going to be worse than ours. It's going to be hotter there because they don't have those trees to absorb the heat in the same way that we do. So, I mean, environmental racism is real like that. I mean, there is a racial gap between my neighborhood and the one next to mine. And that's sort of an interesting as well example on a more local level of how, I guess, climate change is, or even just like nature and ecology and access to resources like that are affecting people differently.
Thank you, Jelena. I think it's quite interesting what you highlighted about this fault line. These fault lines are not only on the global level between countries, but also are within within countries as well. And sometimes it's just a matter of few meters between neighborhoods and you have completely different outcomes. I know very well that this is something Amelia also have worked on, and I think we'll bring her also in later to share her experience on that. But maybe before I move to Amelia, I would like to ask Eoin, because Eoin, you are very active. You study politics, you are very active on this intersection between politics and climate change, which is intrinsically political topic, as you would argue, perhaps. One of the issues that you highlighted is also your interest in tackling just transition. And I was wondering, building on my question, if you can share any examples from these disproportionate impacts of climate change, but particularly if you would like maybe to focus on just transition as well, given that it's one of your focus areas.
100%. Thank you very much. I think whenever you think of a just transition, I think that most people would tend to pose it as the global south, and in terms of the global north, the wealthier countries traditionally over the past couple hundred years needing to step in to provide funds or aid in the wake of climate disasters or to help with the transition. But a just transition also obviously applies to ensuring that just the wealthy people in countries like Ireland, Britain, America aren't able to easily shift to a carbon neutral lifestyle, but that we also bring everyone in the society with us. I live in Northern Ireland, obviously, and we have some of the most deprived areas in the entirety of Western Europe, in West Belfast specifically. It's quite systematic. And whenever you go there, I think that there's a real emotional impact. Whenever you talk to people from there, they are aware that the food that they're buying, that the soap or appliances that they use in their house aren't, very environmentally friendly, and they want to do something about that. But the fact of the matter is that they quite simply can't afford anything else because they're trapped in a poverty cycle. A particular issue which has came up over the cost of living crisis is pay-as-you-go meters here for fuel. So it's either connected to oil or gas and you top it up when you need it. But an issue with that is now within the UK and Ireland, the cheapest form of fuel is now renewables. But these communities can't access that because that doesn't hook up to their house so they can actually use it. So in the long run, they would be paying more as, say, someone who lives in an affluent area who can say, we'll switch to, wind or solar power, because quite simply they just can't access it. And I thought it was really also interesting what Jelena said there about certain communities having access to green spaces and about air pollution. That would be very similar here. I'm looking out my window. In Northern Ireland, we have a thing called the towpath along the Lagan. It runs along the entire way. It's a massive green space right beside a river, fantastic air quality. However, whenever you look at it, it is very, very centered in along the river, and people along the river would tend to be from a unionist background. So here it's the oppressed nationalist minority traditionally would live far further out from where these green spaces would be, and it's a lot less accessible. And that's sort of touching on two themes in relation to just transition, specifically that people in those areas have been made to feel that it's their own personal responsibility to make that a just transition, and that it's not really the role of companies who are doing the most polluting in order to give them cheaper options. But also the cycle of poverty and the sort of capitalist alienation which would go on within large housing estates or within poorer communities has really not enabled people to come together communally in order to embrace more sustainable lifestyles for their entire community, such as gardens, food gardens or little markets. There is some bright spots in Beachmount, which is in West Belfast, in a quite deprived area. There's a thing called the Beachmount, getting the name right here, the Beachmount Community Garden and Market, where people come together every week and they sell local produce. They lend it to people who need things, and it's a really shining example, but there is clearly a lot of work to do in that sense. And we need to step up those who are more privileged in order to aid those communities, because there's a lot they can do themselves, but when it's so systematic, you do need everyone to come together with it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Eoin. I really like how you broadened the concept of just transition, because, of course, people who are familiar with the term and the literature, it started with workers and the energy value chain, particularly transition from coal and coal miners to other sources. But now the term has become a more inclusive of other social dynamics that goes with climate change beyond energy and beyond workers and jobs. It's, as you mentioned, it's the impact of certain policies on communities. And we see that not only in Ireland, but also on the global level, how not only the impacts of climate change have disproportionate effects, but also the climate action itself by governments does have disproportionate effects. For example, one of the issues I deal with on a daily basis is energy subsidies in some countries. And of course, energy subsidies are bad and they have to be abolished because obviously they increase consumption, and usually this consumption is fueled by fossil fuels, etc. But what is missing sometimes is that there is no backup plan to support people who would be impacted by removing energy subsidies. So the first part of the equation is perfect, but there is no continuation to ensure that communities are not left behind. And I really liked how you broadened that concept of just transition. And we might come back actually to this to dig deeper into it. So Amelia, going back to where Jelena started with working with communities, and you are somebody who have done a lot of work with communities as well. I was wondering, again, going back to the initial question, by trying to put a face to this proportionality. Maybe if you can share with us some of the examples you have encountered in your work that shows these impacts.
Sure, of course, I'd be glad to speak on that. So, kind of having attended a predominantly white university in the Bronx, which is predominantly immigrant communities, Black and Brown communities, and it is an economically diverse area of the city, but also holds the most impoverished congressional district in the United States. So generally, kind of from the outside looking in, considered kind of like poor and deprived area, and made into something of a figurehead, I guess, for injustice and poverty in the United States. But then again, not always somewhere that their real needs are addressed. Oftentimes in kind of the conversations that I was able to have in my time doing kind of community engaged learning as a student, community groups would discuss the fact that lots of outside groups, like my own university, but like a lot of, think tanks or political action groups or, outside designers or intellectuals, people like to come in and kind of prescribe solutions or ask to do interviews and visioning sessions, but not necessarily listen to the real ideas and the real objectives of the community groups that are already doing this work. And these become kind of political tokens for congressional representation in the United States, that people talk about environmental injustice, talk about this community, this location in the Bronx, and then don't actually then send checks for groups that are trying to do this work. A really kind of huge example of this is the Cross Bronx Expressway, which I could guess some listeners have kind of heard of, brought up before as an issue of environmental injustice. This was put in in the post-war era in the United States. There was a ton of infrastructural projects happening. They basically sent an expressway through countless existing neighborhoods in the Bronx. This cut off, social and economic networks that had been existing for a while, really struck the resilience of a ton of neighborhoods, just straight through the middle of the borough. And for decades has been a major source of air pollution, of asthma. There's areas of this expressway that have been called Asthma Alley because the rates of asthma, and particularly childhood asthma, are so high there. And these concerns about asthma, came into recent focus during the COVID pandemic. There were really high concentrations of severe COVID cases and COVID deaths in the areas that have been facing, this air pollution for decades. Plenty of politicians have come in and said that they're interested in, mitigating or addressing this issue, in kind of resolving this injustice. Different people have come up with all sorts of design proposals, but for years now, the money has not come, the transition has not come. Ideas have come, which are great, which are useful, but then the investment has not necessarily followed. There's a group called Loving the Bronx that has kind of piloted this effort and has done a lot of great work in collecting the voices and the ideas of people that live along this expressway. But and they've been able to present this to people in power, but then the true investment and the transition has not always followed. And I think that's a major issue in doing environmental justice work. Just regarding where the resources match up with the ideas and the voices, and are the people who have the most kind of stake in their neighborhoods able to make the decisions about where the investment goes and what the investment does. So on a very local level, this is something I've kind of learned a lot about, but it is kind of mirrored on the global level as well, in issues of international aid, development aid and funding, things like that, which I'm sure the other panelists have, a ton of knowledge on as well. But yeah, that's my kind of perspective on that, just in that specific instance. But, issues of racism and environmental racism, definitely are occurring on a domestic level within very wealthy nations, on a very local level within a very wealthy city as well. There's certainly deep environmental racism, environmental injustice occurring, but again, on the global level as well, between nations in the global north, global south.
Great, thank you, Amelia, for sharing these real examples from where you sit. I think also introducing this new fault line of racial injustice and how it interacts with policy action and in terms of environmentalism and climate change. I think one really question I'd like to follow up with you and other panelists maybe later as well is, if you think there is our climate change dialogues are elitist, and if you think they are, how can we overcome this elitism? Because I think this is perhaps connected to this disconnect, or linked to this disconnect between the good intention of policies and how these good intentions are not necessarily translated into good impact on communities because of the lack of this engagement, because the discussion is often concentrated within certain circles. I think this is also something we'll definitely come back to. So stay tuned. I think Jack, I'll go to you, because I think one fascinating thing I read also about your background is that you've spent some time in Africa working as well. So I wonder if, from your again, feel free to mention examples from anywhere. But especially since you have done this work in Africa, it would be great if you can share with us some of the examples you've seen of the impacts of climate change and how these communities and people are dealing with it.
Yeah, for sure, and happily will explain more on the point of sub-Saharan Africa at least. I think it's probably one of the most prominent examples there of the real impact of climate change. Again, was very fortunate to run a fully fledged program to improve smallholder farming capacity in farm crop productivity and produce. But even from chatting with the farmers, we got to understand that that was only one small issue in a very wicked problem, and I think the term wicked problems gets thrown around a lot of the place. A lot of the time it's sustainability, but that's essentially what it is. So, from dealing with the likes of crop failures to a rapid increase in not only drought, but excessive rainfall and flooding. Cyclone Idai hit Malawi very hard in 2019, and the amount of displacement that was caused was shocking. And I think that's a trend that's starting to become more noticeable in Europe now as well, climate migration. Understandably so, if individuals can't support themselves and their families, they'll have to move somewhere else. And I think that's a real concerning issue that's becoming a lot more vivid now. And it kind of talks on systems, and I know we're going to talk about systems and how efficient are they really later on in this panel, but it really highlights the the forthcoming challenges that's going to affect everybody. And there was a couple of really good points made by the other panelists there previously on, on the elitism, on the fact that, it seems to be an issue that isn't really addressed by the global north. But I do think that's going to start becoming a lot more apparent in the everyday lives of the global north. We're incredibly fortunate here in Ireland, like exceptionally fortunate. We're seeing a rise in temperature at the moment, and we're seeing slight variations in the weather, but ultimately that's the biggest issues that we have in climate right now. More wind, but it's nothing excessive and nothing to a degree of putting people into too much danger. But I think because of that, and even dealing with a lot of students, because they can't see the issues and because we can't see the issues in Ireland, it's very difficult for them to relate to them. And if they can't relate to them, it's very difficult to act on it. So I'm cautious that I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole on this, but it's from my own experiences, it is two very different realities. Operating on the ground in Malawi, which again, exceptionally fortunate to have the opportunity to do so and move the needle in a very small way on crop security, but you're starting to see it more prominent now. We look at the US on food security, on crops, on everything like that. And again, Ireland is very strong as an agricultural nation, but next 5, 10, 15 years, that could start to change. And in those whole dynamics, those geopolitical systems get more tense. We can see the issue of food security in Europe with conflict, with war that Russia has waged by invading Ukraine, that the crop and food security shortages and issues there. But what I feel that people are slow to understand is that that's going to be more commonplace, not from conflict, but from climate change down the line. So, there's plenty more things on Earth there, but I don't want to go too deep either.
No, absolutely. And I think this compounding factor, and climate change is a shock by itself, but sometimes it can happen in parallel with other shocks that could make the impact even bigger. I think while listening to you, I also, of course, you work in Malawi. I remember my work in Iraq because we had a similar situation. Agriculture in Iraq of course, Iraq is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. But if you take oil away, the second biggest sector actually is agriculture. And agriculture is so important because it's the biggest employer in the country. I think it employs 20% of Iraqis. So climate change already started to impact food security and livelihood of Iraqi farmers. And as you rightly said, there is already a trend of migrating. Like we see evidence their land because it's unproductive and moving on to other cities and other areas, creating this social strain on services, on demographics, and creating a lot of problems. So I think this is an ongoing problem, and that will only unfortunately get more serious. This links between climate change, food security, and displacement and migration. I think this first round of questions have really opened many other areas of discussion that I'm really keen to delve into. But maybe before we come back to some of the issues we discussed on just transition, on elitism, etc., I would like to take advantage of you also being exposed to global governance of climate change. I know that too. I'm not sure. I think Jack and Jelena, I think, if I'm not mistaken, both of you participated in COP27. I'm not sure about Eoin and Amelia. Have you participated? Okay, so maybe let me start with Jack and Jelena and to ask them about their kind of reflections on these COPs, and maybe I think to link them to what we have been discussing. Like when you were at COPs, were there discussions of this sort? Was a discussion, because of course COP is like a very condensed conference, I'm sure. And there's a lot of agendas being discussed. But I was wondering, given what we discussed so far about this, impact on communities, to what extent this was present at COP, and maybe give us your honest reflections. And then I can also ask Amelia and Eoin to come in with their own reflections of COP, if any. So maybe Jelena, maybe if you'd like to start with this, and then Jack.
Sure. I wasn't at COP27 actually, but I was at COP26 the year before. And that was definitely a year of inequity. The key topic that a lot of people were talking about at that COP was just the accessibility of the conference itself. Since it was November 2021, I guess. So it was right in the middle of COVID. The conference did have a real accessibility issue because there were vaccine requirements and COVID testing requirements to be able to enter the conference, and not all of the countries around the world at that point had access to vaccines. So it meant that I think it was an abnormally sort of, not selective, but like an abnormally hard to attend COP because a lot of people from maybe poorer countries or countries with less access to healthcare were able to attend. So it meant that a lot of the voices that were heard were from, like we've been talking about, from the global north, which is, I think, always the case at COP. But at COP26 specifically, it meant that that was felt even more strongly. I think it also kind of meant that there was a lot of tension at that conference generally. I mean, of course, people were stressed about COVID. That was an issue unto itself, but it sort of heightened, I think, the almost political tension that was also there, just because you have some people from the global north, of course, who are going to be advocating on behalf of poorer countries. But I don't know, it kind of had a bad feel to it, I think, because yeah, so many of those political discussions and political decisions that were being made were just like totally inaccessible to people who should have been there. I also know, Ali, I already told you and Amelia this story the other day, but one of the most interesting things that I saw at COP was I met a delegate from the Kingdom of Tonga in the Western Pacific. And again, to harp on the inaccessibility, he was the only person at COP26 representing Tonga, but I was very privileged to be able to speak with him. And he was talking there with a man from New Zealand about sort of adaptation climate plans they had in Tonga, since it's such a small island and since the Pacific is so at risk for like sea level rise. It meant that kind of his whole country's livelihood was very much at risk from flooding, and very, very soon, like they were already starting to experience flooding on the coasts. And with those two countries working together and pooling their resources, they were able to come up with this like super cool adaptation plan to sort of like elevate the whole island of Tonga onto itself, which of course is sort of a temporary solution. It's more of like a Band-Aid, and then you have to, I guess, just elevate it again and wait for the sea levels to rise more. But I did think that it was a very like, I don't know, it stuck in my head a lot as kind of a very ingenuitive solution to climate change, and also a good thing that we should look at as an example, because you have a country like Tonga that doesn't have enough money to, make those kinds of ambitious adaptation plans for itself. But when this man Uli was able to attend COP and, network and share his story like that and work with countries that have the funds to take on projects like that, it was like so productive of them. So
thanks Jelena for sharing this question. I think before moving to Jack, let me ask you, since also this is a youth discussion as well, how would you characterize youth participation in COP as well? I know this is a bit outside the kind of the topics that we've been discussing, but I could not resist not to ask this question to you and to Jack. So let me start with you, Jelena. Yeah.
I'm really glad you asked, actually. I should have mentioned that before. That's another interesting accessibility thing at COP, but also generally that I think I've been really focused on throughout my activism is indeed that like conferences like COP are incredibly inaccessible to young people. I was so lucky to be able to go, and I had an organization here in Chicago that was able to fund me to go, and they were also able to organize like my entry into the more like COP has like two different zones. So the more kind of restricted like political zone that isn't open to the public, they were able to facilitate my entry into that second zone. So I mean, I got really lucky because I kind of had that entry done for me. But for the most part, there are no young people at COP. Like, it's really not. That's not to say that there aren't young people. Like, there were a ton of young people in Glasgow at the time. There was a huge like Fridays for Future protest that happened during COP. But inside of the actual conference, like, people were definitely kind of double taking like I was there with a group of other young people, and people were kind of like, what are these people doing there? I found that actually, especially as well, when I went to my second UN climate conference, which was a smaller conference. It was called MOP, which I think is kind of a silly name. But when I went to MOP in Montreal, I found that especially because COP is kind of a flagship conference. It's very much like a big deal if you're in the environmental world. But MOP was less so a big deal. And at MOP, that was even more the case. Like, I was bound to be the only person under 25 there, which is, really cool for me, but I think it's incredibly problematic. I think that, you can tell here, there are 4 of us who are young and who have important things to say. And that's something that I've run into throughout my whole environmental, not career really, but, my whole environmental journey, is that, I've always been advocating for adults sort of being more willing to hear the voices of young people when they're creating policy, but it's something that is like so hard to make happen. And I think it's something that, we're really missing.
No, absolutely, especially that your generation and the generations that will come next will carry a heavier burden year after year from climate. Jack, over to you, your reflections as well. Maybe first also on how would you view or assess youth participation in COPs, but bring us also back to the first question, which was on like how do you assess this mechanism of global governance in general?
Exactly. So I have to start with the preface that I've never actually attended a COP, which is really frustrating, and it's something that I'm hoping to change. But as part of my time, I was the UN Youth Delegate for Ireland back in 2019, 2020. So I got to live in New York for 6 weeks during the General Assembly, and also got to attend a high-level political forum. And I think it's just good old-fashioned tokenism gets thrown at a wall and just see it if it sticks. It's youth participation isn't really at the standard that it needs to be at an international level. There are challenges around that. And Jelena made an excellent point on accessibility. It is incredibly difficult for a student or a young person to financially validate their ability to actively participate in that. But then ultimately there's a responsibility, Ali, on placed upon these organizations that they need to do more to get not only just young people at the table. They're starting to do that, but they need to get them actively participating. It was mentioned there in a previous comment, like that proactive participation, good democratic ways of getting students not only thinking about, but actively engaging and helping to shape the direction of policy, or direction of new ideas, infrastructure, what have you. Ultimately, that's just not the case. And you tend to see that a lot of the time with the likes of the General Assembly, for example, back in 2019, so pre-COVID, before everything went south, that you can get young people at the table, but in order to get them making a difference, you have to give them the tools, the skills, and the resources to be able to do that, and the confidence as well. It's an incredibly intimidating thing for a young person to be at a table with however many, whatever the equivalent, senior levels or, ambassadors or policy analysts or whatever that is. That's a scary environment at the best of times for anybody. You put a young person in there, it's who already know or may feel that they're not actually wanted there. That's tough. So you have to really create that space, and that's something that gets thrown around an awful lot, and it kind of falls into the trap of cliche. But you have to create that safe space for a student or for a young person in order to be comfortable enough to not necessarily just have all the answers, but just start asking questions. It's a big challenge I've seen, especially with young people or with students I work with now in the University of Limerick. The students are getting, well, some of them at least, are less inclined to just ask questions for the sake of asking questions, like really provoking and I suppose prodding and poking at these institutions, at these systems to see, why is it like this? Why isn't it getting more change done? It's and I know we will be talking about institutions, and I'm ready to go in at the inefficiencies of institutions when that question does come around. But ultimately, from my experience, at all these conferences, you see pockets of really good proactive engagement with young people and for young people and by young people. But unfortunately, that's kind of the exception, not the rule, I feel.
Thank you, Jack and Jelena, for these honest reflections on youth participation. And let me also use the same platform to go to Amelia and Eoin to reflect of their perception, if any, on COPs, but in general about this global governance system of climate change and how they think this youth component is playing out as well. So Amelia, please share with us your views.
Of course. I guess I do have less experience on just like working on the global level, networking on the global level as well, compared to some of these other panelists. But I would say, kind of just from my own perspective, I do feel pretty awfully pessimistic about existing global systems to address the problems, and with the radical solutions that really are necessary at this point. I think, oftentimes the solutions that are presented from kind of the global level down, are using existing tools or are working to preserve existing power structures in ways that are just kind of entrenched in those systems, and unfortunately do not go deep enough into the problems, which are rooted in environmental destruction and resource exploitation, but also in economic inequality, geopolitical inequality. These things are going so deeply hand in hand that I'm not always optimistic about, using existing geopolitical tools to solve them. Although, that's not to say that delegates sent by countries to discuss and address these problems are working with bad intentions necessarily. I think it's just that there are so many assumptions about the way our economic systems should work, the way our political systems should work, that are, just so deeply entrenched and left kind of without questioning. But that is to say, that young people don't necessarily have these ideas as entrenched as older generations, especially students, who are brought to learn about the roots of issues, the interconnectedness of issues, and specifically speaking from kind of an environmental studies perspective, and I'm sure it's kind of academic perspective shared by environmental science students as well. We are all definitely taught to be systems thinkers, learning about interconnected environmental, ecological, climate issues, social issues, the way that these all kind of work together, I think does allow young people, and specifically young people who have taken it upon themselves to learn a lot about these issues, to kind of see how they are working, see where these systems are kind of failing us, and to not necessarily be so deeply attached to the way things should be, the way things have to be, or this is the reality of the situation. I do think, obviously, that goes without saying, that's why it's important to bring young people to the table, because we are not holding on so tightly to the way things are, the way things have to be.
No, absolutely. And I think, Eoin, also, while moving to you, I would like to acknowledge that we already have a number of very interesting questions in the chat room. So we have question from Dan in Brooklyn, Stefan in Queens, Hannah, Chicago, and Moira in Ireland. We'll come back to these questions because some of them are already touching on the topic that we're discussing. For example, Stefan is asking if we can discuss the idea of loss and damage that was discussed primarily in the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. I think also Hannah's question is quite relevant to what Amelia was talking about. Hannah is asking, do you think global leaders who are so far removed from the impacts of climate can be motivated to understand and take action? So Eoin, reflecting on everything you've heard so far, reflecting on these questions and your personal reflections as well, please tell us your opinion.
So sort of to touch on the COP points first, I guess, I think the most sort of iconic, word to use from COP26 for me would be the slogan, keep 1.5 alive. And I don't know about the other panelists, but I find that absolutely laughable that, these countries and world leaders can sit there and say, we're going to keep it to 1.5 degrees of warming, which frankly is too much already. And also you're not putting the policies in place to actually achieve. And I mean, the IPCC, I think, said that best case scenario, we're heading for 1.7, and, you know, sort of okay-ish scenario, we're more in the 2.3 range. The policies which were agreed at COP26 and 27 are great if you're living in the 1980s, but we live in 2020, and quite frankly, the policies which they're suggesting aren't good enough. The carbon and emissions which we produce today aren't the things which are increasing, you know, temperatures next year or reducing your air quality now. It's going to do it for the next 20 to 30 years, you know, and it's a real issue. The time to be incremental, like I said, it was the 80s, but now we do need that radical change that the other panelists have been talking about. I think specifically sort of from the youth perspective, like I haven't been to COP, I haven't been to climate conference, but whenever COP was going on, I was doing a module on climate change, and sort of as everything's been going on, we've been discussing it in the Politics Society in our sort of bi-monthly discussion sessions. And something which a lot of young people bring up, which they're really not happy about, is the inclusion of oil and other energy companies within the COP framework. Of course, it's really important to engage with these people because they're the ones doing the emissions, you know, but they are frustrated that these companies are having such a say over the restrictions that will need to be put on them. To go back to the sort of just transition point that I meant, I was expanding that to use, you know, to people across the world ensuring that happens, but people are also trying to use that term as we needed just transitions for the oil companies and to ensure that, you know, shareholders still get value for money. And quite frankly, that's not going to happen. You know, the just transition is about ensuring fairness, and whenever these companies are abusing their position and their profits, quite frankly, they're the ones who need to be sharing that, not receiving it. But people are generally angry about it, and the best carbon, you know, emissions that we use are the ones which don't exist. And, you know, the change needs to be coming faster on that. And just relating to sort of touch on briefly the questions which we had from the audience there, you know, I think from sort of, I suppose my angry tirade I had there, the leaders in the global north are not doing enough. Young people do not have enough of a say. We know what the solutions are. They're all out there. It's not like, you know, we need a summit for world leaders to sit down and try and figure out the solutions. Scientists did that for us in the early 2000s, but prior to that. So I think there's a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, but that if channeled correctly could be passion to bring the change, which is direly needed, quite frankly.
So Eoin, let me stay with you because I think so far you have really put on the table, all of you, not only you, Eoin, but all the panelists, you have put on the table a lot of issues that we need to challenge. So now my job with the questions that are coming from the audience is to challenge you on some of these ideas and try to go a level deeper in the discussion. So we have a question from Dan in Brooklyn, Eoin, I think it would be great to answer. Can there ever be a truly just transition? Sorry, can there ever truly be a just transition?
Well, thank you very much to Dan for the question. The answer is, again, a frustrating one. Yes, there absolutely can be. Is it going to happen? Is it realistic? No, not the way I see it. For a just transition, quite frankly, the capitalist systems which we have right now are focused on profit, and that does come at the exploitation of workers and people in general, you know, in terms of what they consume. Like, for a lot of people will be substandard. You know, countries, and we've seen it, you know, in the sort of COVID crisis, in times of crisis, which the climate crisis, and as that worsens will be, countries will turn to themselves and say, oh, well, okay, maybe, you know, Mali needs, you know, food and water and helps with flood alleviation and climate disaster response. But then they're going to say, oh, but at the same time, that might be happening to us. As things start to get a bit more risky for them, they'll say, we need to, you know, invest in shoring up our own shores. We need to invest in our own food security and our own energy security. So a just transition is hard. It is achievable, but it would require, the uprooting of our entire systems, because there's a few good books on this. I'll name drop quickly. There's a book about petrocultures. Basically, the short of it is our entire system since the 1940s, that moment of massive change after the Second World War, it's all built around petrol, cars, plastic, and we need to undo all of that. We can all live at the standard of a 1950s American, which I don't know, what the conception for that of everyone would be, but it seems quite a cushy lifestyle to me. It doesn't seem too foreign to perhaps what we would live now. It requires a lot of work and a lot of undoing, but I think that there is still hope, specifically if, sort of our generation, the younger generation, is listened to and allowed to act. I'll leave it for the people watching and maybe the other panelists to say how likely it would be that that's going to happen.
I think personally, I share some of the cynicism that Dan has in the question. I think, of course, just transition is absolutely critical and important, but I feel sometimes there are some contexts that the bigger issue, there are bigger justice issues. For example, I come from Lebanon, a country with known dysfunctional electricity system. We don't have functional power system, and most people are dependent on diesel generators that are owned by, local elite, and usually, so when we talk about moving in Lebanon, moving from diesel generators to solar panels, of course, you have a just transition component, but it's not as important as it is for the entire nation, right? To get rid of this polluting system of generating power. Also, transition happens also outside climate change. Like, for example, right now we are living in the AI transition, and so many jobs would be lost. And we have seen several transitions before. Of course, we have to do our best to overcome some of these challenges, but at the same time acknowledge that these challenges are perhaps a kind of a price that we have to pay. We have to minimize, but nonetheless, it's a price that we have to pay. Before I move to the other questions, I wonder if any of the panelists would like to come in on this just transition idea, if they have any further thoughts on that.
I think Eoin sums it up quite well, to be honest with you. It's it is, I'm painfully optimistic, because if you weren't at least some bit delusional in your own right, it'd be very difficult to engage in sustainability as a full-time job. It's but it's difficult, and that's perhaps the reason why we should be doing it. It's because it is hard, because it's a challenge, because it's a difficult thing to do. That's the reason to do it. It's because if it were easy, it'd be done. It's and we can see that with a lot of different things. Look at different countries had different responses, but look at the response rate of COVID. When things had to get done, it got done. So now it's just really showcasing. I think a big thing and an issue in the narrative is, like, with sustainability, and especially with climate change, it can be quite polarizing sometimes, insofar as the people who can make the difference either become entirely crippled and paralyzed by the overwhelming challenge that's there, or else they just become entirely apathetic for different reasons, whether they don't have exposure to it, or whether it's just not a significant thing, whether it's voters or whatever area or region that they're operating in. But I think a big game changer could be to really twisting that narrative a bit more to say that climate change doesn't have to be, or that sustainability, it has to be this massive trade-off. It doesn't have to be a substitution. It could be an improvement, because ultimately that's what it is. And that's, I think if you frame sustainability like that, especially in the fight for climate change, it's an improvement. It's it's about seeing these issues that seriously need a lot of overhaul and change, but that you could do it in a healthy, beneficial way. And I think that could really move the needle and maybe reduce the polarization that we kind of see between ideology and practice.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think another challenge to the panel is, of course, we have heard a lot of cynicism regarding the global governance system of climate, especially with regards to COP. But you could argue that there are some successes, small successes that are emerging. For example, the question from Stefan in Queens to discuss, he's asking us to discuss the loss and damage fund that was established. I'm not sure there's money yet in the fund. Maybe there's no money yet in it, but at least nonetheless, it's a progress. So I was wondering, like, how do you see these small successes? Maybe Jelena, of course you haven't been to the previous COP in Egypt, but maybe I'm sure you've been following closely. How would you look at this loss and damage fund idea, and do you think it's enough of a success to not to lose faith in this COP mechanism?
I'm worried that I don't know enough about the loss and damages fund to speak on it specifically, but just thoughts on small successes in general, especially at COP. I think that there are small successes. I think that it's a really interesting question actually, because I think that a lot of young people are very cynical about COP and see it as kind of all of these really wealthy politicians that are flying out to whatever country is hosting it that year and, kind of talking about nothing for 8 days and then making a policy that doesn't really meet the IPCC guidelines and not really sticking to it anyway. Like, there are a lot of problems. But at the same time, as someone who was there, I think that there are a lot of benefits to COP maybe that aren't seen necessarily by the people who don't attend, which is also hard because that becomes its own sort of elitist, unfair, unequal sort of perspective, because I know that not everyone can attend COP. But I think at least for me personally, it was a huge learning opportunity. And so I don't think that COP as a whole necessarily is a bad thing for everyone. I think that having everyone there in the same space, thinking about climate, everyone in Glasgow, in the city of Glasgow, was thinking about climate. They were taking huge steps to sort of be this city that was hosting COP. They were electrifying their bus system in anticipation for COP. There were all these sorts of green ads and people with green technology pitches that were coming to Glasgow. I think that there is some good that comes out of still having this annual, huge in the news discussion about climate change, even if maybe politically it's not super productive. And also, I don't know, this is hard because I know that COP has its problems, but I think that it is still a valuable thing, even politically, because if you have the small wins that are coming out of it, like a loss and damages fund, that's something that might not have happened without COP. So if you have little things that are coming out of it, then I would still say overall, it's probably a good thing. It's just not enough.
Thank you, Jelena. I think, Amelia, let me put also the next question to you and use it to go back to something that you've mentioned earlier. So we have a question from Ireland, from Moira. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. So Moira is asking, what can we do as individuals with regards to climate change? And I think let me also use that to mention or to go back to the point of elitism, climate change and elitism, and breaking this policy-making cycle. How can we break that cycle? How can we make policy-making more engaging with communities? And how can we break this elitism cycle? And how can individuals play a bigger role?
Great. I'm super happy to answer this question. I guess specifically from an environmental humanities perspective, which is a lot of kind of what I studied in school, how our arts and literature and cultural discussions are engaging with topics of nature and the environment. That gets down a lot to an individual level concern that I'm particularly interested in. There's a lot of conversation about how none of the responsibility can be on the individual because it is such a systemic issue, that climate change is kind of being brought about by corporations and wealthy nations, things like that, which is the case. But on the individual level, especially in the West, in wealthy countries like the United States and in part Ireland, there's also kind of an individual conception that development and economic growth comes with a detachment from the natural world, that people who are at risk of climate change, or like communities in the global south that are more integrated with the natural world, or more reliant on the land, or more encountering non-human life, that that's not something that's desirable because they're at risk of climate change, and that a solution is to build up our separation from the natural world, to build like seawalls and infrastructural projects, things like that, which are part of the mitigation solutions. But on the individual level, in the West, recognizing ourselves as equally integrated with the natural world, even if we're not as equally at risk of facing damage to our lifestyles or our sustenance by environmental destruction, we are still a part of a natural world and a part of ecological systems. Humans are not like exempt from the world, I guess. And on an individual level, kind of just changing your consumption, changing your waste habits, things like that are actions that might not, completely, pivot the entire global system, but they challenge us to, think about how us as individuals are relating to the natural world that we belong in. Do we need all of the things that we have? I would guess for many of the listeners, that would be no, we don't need everything that we seek to consume. And this kind of does lead us to challenge, why our economic systems, our political systems are the way that they are, just by kind of challenging our very personal, our very individual level, relationship with the natural world, which that's not a great solution. It's nothing that you can just go out and, just do and check off of a list. But I would encourage listeners, on the individual level, that does make a difference. Not just thinking about it on a personal level, but then also talking with the people you are in community with, the people that you live near or share an environment with, talking to them about how they connect with or feel disconnected from, a natural world. And then, solutions can really, really grow out of that on a grassroots level, but then kind of inspiring solutions on a higher level. I, as many of the other panelists have shared, was like way stuck in pessimism for like a lot of my kind of like wean into my teen years, but have definitely found optimism and inspiration coming out of just conversations with people who, again, might not share, their political conceptions of climate change, but you might have an enlightening conversation about, your local stream and like changes that that person has seen in their lifetime to, bird migrations or things like that. Again, not a very easy individual level solution, but something that does certainly make an impact that you can do yourself like tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you, Amelia. And I think, so I have two reactions to what you just said. I think the first one is I completely agree with the fact that, of course, it's a climate solving a big or complex challenge such as climate change. It requires everybody's action, including especially individuals, but also governments and everybody. But on the individual level, I fully agree that there are so many behavioral issues that or actions that we can take that can make a big difference. I remember a few days ago reading an article in the Washington Post about how by using recycled clothes and like how the fashion industry can be transformed, and just by for example not buying fast fashion from which piece of clothes that we wear for a few weeks and then we throw away, etc. So I mean, this is again a small example, but if you count if you aggregate the emissions of the fashion industry is like 7%, 6 or 7% globally, which is not insignificant. Of course, if you incorporate the transport and manufacturing and all the other aspects of it. So absolutely, individuals do have a massive role to play. Of course, they have to be supported with economic incentives and economic nudges and policies to help them go into that route. But also on the deeper moral level, it has to be also the case, even without the presence of these incentives. But the second part, or the second reaction, is something I would like to challenge you on. And I think this is also goes to Eoin as well, because I know he's interested in these things. The idea of degrowth, the idea, yeah, you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, and please correct me, Amelia, if I haven't, you are asking or advocating that we should rethink economic growth. And for me, again, like this could be at best a challenging task or challenging ask. Maybe if you look at developed countries, you could perhaps go away with that. But in developing countries, this is a big no-no. Like when you talk to policymakers in countries that don't even have electricity and tell them about degrowth, they will simply not listen to you, because for them, their main issue, of course, climate change is increasingly on their mind, maybe not the priority, but of course they are aware of it because there's a global norm being built around it. But their immediate priority is the growth and achieving basic services. And most of the emissions that will happen over the next 2 or 3 decades are coming from countries that are growing very fast. So is it a question of not growing, or is it a question of growing differently, Amelia?
Yeah, I think this, ties in very directly with our conversation earlier about a just transition that kind of demands of wealthy countries some sacrifice, and then on behalf of poor and developing countries, gains of resources. I think it, from my perspective, is a redistribution of power and resources to, ask wealthier countries to cease consumption, or, decrease their consumption, limit their economic growth, or at least kind of question, why the assumptions of growth is needed in wealthier countries in which many people already kind of are living, outside of the necessary levels of consumption. But I would not say that, degrowth is something that can be just activated in any context, or should be activated in any context, without understanding the economic situation of that specific country, and that specific, even on a community level, the needs of people, and the objectives of those communities as they grow. So I understand completely why degrowth would not necessarily be something that can be evenly applied, or just kind of occurring, from a top-down global level. But I think there's places, in the United States specifically, that frankly should not have as many resources or as much wealth as they do currently have. And redistributing that wealth specifically is a great solution, kind of to limit consumption on one end, and to allow, developing nations to access, those basic needs as well: clean water, electricity, education, infrastructure, things like that, it's not right that developing nations should just go without that.
Great, thanks, Amelia, for clarification. I would like to bring Jack as well, because with his experience in Africa, it would be interesting to hear his view on this dichotomy between growth and having futures free of emissions. But first, let me move to Eoin, because I know that personally he has a personal interest in this issue. Eoin.
Thank you very much. I think whenever I sort of talk about degrowth, it should sort of more be interpreted as we need to move past growth. Countries should not be considering the need to grow their wealth and their GDP exponentially. I think sort of a concept which New Zealand came up with recently, I think it was probably 2 years now, so not that recent, but Jacinda Ardern talked about a happiness budget, measuring, instead of GDP, you measure how happy and satisfied the people are, what their quality of life is like, and that sort of being the go-to measurement. I know sort of in your opening introduction there, Ali, to this entire thing, you discussed about how GDP isn't always the best way to sort of measure the status of a country and how well its people are doing. And I think that that very much so comes into play in this specifically. Whenever you do look at countries in the global south, in particular Africa, whenever we talk about growth, a lot of it is neo-colonialism. It's, British, American, French, German firms coming down, buying up mines, extracting the wealth, paying, the miners pitiful wages, which is barely enough to, survive day to day from, and then bringing that wealth to, their shareholders and their company themselves. And a lot of that growth then would be translated to somewhere like the UK or Germany or any of the other examples I said. But also sort of to tackle it head on as well, if we do take it as the literal thing of degrowth. There was a study, and for the life of me, I can't remember who did the research, but it is out there. You can look it up. If every single person in the world consumed like an American, we would need 2 Earths. If it's European, it's something around 1.5 Earths would be needed. And just when you look at those numbers, it's not an issue of, is degrowth feasible? It's degrowth is necessary, and we need to figure it out before it's too late, because if everything goes to that and, the developed countries stay where they are, the developing countries go up to meet them, quite frankly, there isn't enough Earth for everyone to survive like that. And, if there's not enough Earths for that, it means we've consumed and hollowed out the one that we already live in. There's a few other sort of interesting things I go into which sort of relate to the previous question about what can individuals do, such as rewilding and all that. But I feel like that might be straying a bit too far from the brief right now. So maybe we can circle back around to that or something.
Sure. I mean, we can also come back in the end for any final remarks or anything you would like to add that you haven't had the chance to add, and feel free, Eoin, to answer that later. But Jack, moving again to you with your experiences as well, how would you look at this issue of growth? Like, I think Owen's point, if I understood correctly, it's about redistribution of this growth, more than like, I think my sense, I'm increasingly convinced that there is a terminology problem, because the term degrowth could be scary to some people. So we might need to find a new term to showcase that, countries can still get prosperity, and livelihood can still be better, but it doesn't have to be very polluting. But Jack, I'm keen to hear from you.
Yeah, for sure. So I need to start with the preface that I studied international business. I don't want people to hold it against me. It's but so definitely, but it always begs a very interesting question when you look at the economy and the role of economic factors and profit, capitalism, all of these systems in ultimately sustainable development. But I think you mentioned a really good point there, Ali, which is like the reframing of what degrowth means, and I think Eoin summed it up really well in his point just there. It's moving beyond growth. It's moving past the economic growth that we see. So, you take sustainability, for example, it's under 3 main pillars. It's economic, it's environmental, and it's social. They all work together and they're all very important. But let's say for the more developed nations, so let's take Ireland as an example. We do quite well in terms of, economics. Fiscally, we're pretty solid, we're pretty sound, recovered quite well from the European and global recession just over a decade ago. So let's just take that, if Ireland is scoring higher, doing well in economic growth, let's look at growth in a social aspect. Let's look at growth in an environmental aspect. Let's keep looking at growth, but let's just kind of change that it isn't necessarily just on economics anymore. And I think it is that kind of mindset shift that needs to be done, that it doesn't, again, I made a previous point, it doesn't have to be all of these immense trade-offs where people are worse off, but in fact, by taking the focus off the economic growth for a nation like this, that you can have an improvement, that it's better to look differently rather than having this trade-off. And, I think there could be a perception sometimes that, it means everything has to be taken away from us. But as Eoin said in his point, sorry, Eoin, I should be like quoting you at this stage for everything you're saying, because I couldn't agree more. It's about, is it an issue in consumerism? Like, how do we actually just get better lifestyles, better habits, better attitudes towards these things? But again, a focus on betterment, on improvement, and I think kind of changing the lens and the narrative on what changing growth means would certainly go a long way to kind of bring those who be a bit more either apathetic or scared to jump along the sustainable development process, especially on climate.
Thanks, Jack. I guess this discussion so far has been very productive in identifying what I can call like anchors of change in terms of looking at starting from the individual level, moving to the community, and trying to navigate all the important issues that come with community work in terms of racial issues, environmental interactions, moving up to the country level and how these policies in the country level can be more sensitive to social issues, moving up to the global level and the global governance level, and how can these discussions become, despite the small successes or as you mentioned, the small wins, how can these discussions become even more relevant as you move forward? I think we have identified a number of these anchors of change on all of these levels. And I was wondering if, I'm aware that we have limited time left, maybe 5 minutes. Maybe we could use this last 5 minutes to go around to essentially share with us any final thoughts, something that you wanted to say, you haven't had the chance to say it, questions I should have asked, but I didn't. Maybe I'll start with you, Jelena. Yeah, and then I move to the others.
Sure. This is obviously me speaking as a science student, so someone who's already interested in science, but the whole time we've been having this discussion, it keeps on sort of coming to my mind that we keep talking about people maybe in the global north, particularly not, since we may not be experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand, that we just don't care as much, or people find it harder to care. And that is where I think that science and better education needs to come in, because at least for me personally, that was my gateway into doing all of the sustainability work that I've done since, was learning about climate science. And that's why I'm studying it now, because I think it's very relevant and I find it very interesting. But I think that without a deep and society-wide broad understanding of climate science, I don't think that, I feel like it's hard for people to find the motivation inside of themselves to help an issue like this if they don't understand what's going on. And I think that understanding it through the science is the best way that we can get there. So especially as we were talking about individual actions, I feel like that's also kind of a worthwhile individual action, is just watch a documentary or something, read a book, teach yourself the broad strokes of climate science, learn about the greenhouse effect. I love the greenhouse effect. I think it's so interesting. And I feel like that is, a super way for people to boost their own personal motivation. And at least for me, that's kind of what fuels my work on this stuff, is having a deeper understanding of what's happening. And from that, you can learn about other solutions. You can learn about individual actions that you can take, and you can understand how those are going to affect the world around you. But yeah, that's kind of that was my number one thing that I wanted to get off my chest.
No, that's very interesting, and I fully agree that it's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to explore. Amelia, Jelena, highlighted the science part. I know that you are very interested in the arts part, and unfortunately, I found it super interesting in your profile, this art component. Unfortunately, you haven't had the chance to maybe talk about it maybe next time. But for now, any final thoughts from your side, reflections on this discussion?
Of course, yeah. I guess I would respond to that by just sharing that one of the reasons that I find the environmental humanities and art so interesting as a true solution to this is because it can maybe, or at least it aspires to work at a level kind of outside of the really stigmatized and politicized kind of conversations about climate change. Obviously, it is a political issue, and it has a lot of political components to solving climate change. But that said, everybody should be able to engage with this issue and engage with this conversation. Everybody should have, reasons to talk to the people around them about nature and the environment, and to alienate that from, regular conversations, and to try to say, that's not something you want to talk about because you don't want to be political. That does kind of hold back solutions to addressing this crisis. So that's kind of maybe a point of inspiration, that just maybe reading about or discussing art or discussing films that kind of expose our human relationship with the environment is an interesting kind of gateway to bringing together all sorts of people to talk about this issue, not just you know, like us college educated young people who are you know, maybe falling towards a certain political alignment and coming up with solutions that fall under that. So that would be kind of my last words on a takeaway.
Absolutely. And actually, let me also maybe call on the NYIC to take on this idea and maybe have a discussion around this, like a separate discussion. It can be part of next year's conference, but not necessarily. Maybe we can do it even sooner. Eoin.
Okay, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. Just circling back to that point I was wanting to make earlier on, is just in connecting the sort of idea of the local to the sort of indigenous. So first of all, in terms of just the Irish example, whenever the place names are very important is what I'm trying to say. So I live in Belfast. Belfast is a word which means nothing. The Irish for Belfast is Belfarstia, which means mouth of the river Farset. So from that immediately, you have a whole different understanding of what the place is. You go, oh, there's a river there. But interestingly, whenever you go to Belfast, you'll notice the river there's the Lagan, not the Farset. The Farset was covered up and has really decreased in size. There's other cities like Derry, Dura in Irish means oak wood. Whenever you go there, it's a city, it's not an oak wood. Yeah, there's some trees on the outskirts, but it's not that much. And I know the same is very true with place names in America, whenever you look at sort of the indigenous peoples and their names for the land. So I think there's a really, really important role for whenever we are sort of transitioning to a carbon neutral world, is to really embrace, you know, sort of like Amelia said, the art and the language and the history. And sort of it makes you stop and think and go, why isn't it like that now? One thing that everyone sort of discussed there as well was the need to increase involvement in education. Just something interesting that I've done with my friends and we're looking at introducing in the Politics Society is there was a concept during the Spanish Civil War of anarchist reading rooms where basically people would go, you would have someone maybe cooking, you would have someone sewing, and someone would just be sat there reading a book to educate the people. And I think that that's a really, really interesting concept, which could be introduced sort of across the world as a way to increase people's involvement. Is that maybe, yes, you aren't the most, you know, academic person, or you don't know a lot about the science, but more than likely there's someone in your life who does know about that. So you can all come together. It's sort of like a knowledge sharing idea. I just mentioned the name of it there briefly, so people can go and look at it after. And the last sort of point I want to bring up is for people watching this after this finishes, contact your local representatives and ask them to stop cutting the grass wherever you live. It's on the side of a motorway, a highway for the American viewers, sort of, you know, in your local area, roundabouts. It's great for local biodiversity in order to have those places there. If you have a garden, I have at my front, there's 2 patches of grass. One of them we've let completely go wild. So that's going to sort of become a meadow. It allows local bees and insects to sort of go there. You can even get these things called seed bombs. Just make sure they're native flowers to your area. Just scatter them around, and you'll notice in, you know, a year and a half, some lovely flowers will come. So it's lovely to look at, but it's also incredible for the biodiversity in your area. Also, you can grow food. Strawberry season's coming up. Run down to your local shop, just buy some strawberry seeds, put them out in your garden. But thank you also very much for hosting this, and to all the fellow panelists. I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's very engaging, and I hope that everyone at home has enjoyed it too.
Thank you very much, Eoin. Jack, you have the last word of the panel.
Yeah, honestly, it is kind of hard to add on anything else that's been said. I suppose one thing that I would love to see is like a real investment on human capital, like really educating and like upskilling young people. And as Jelena made it, like, you know, make it the norm, make it interesting to watch a documentary about something. I love rabbit holes. Like, you could talk to me about stamps and I would have an interest in it. It's but you know, it's about instilling that culture that, you know, continuously do better to increase that. And I think that onus kind of falls on organizations, whether you're going in through, you know, a graduate program or an entry-level job or whatever that may look like. normalizing the conversation on sustainability, but as well as that, like normalizing conversations and building skills for young people to act productively, disagree with each other, to look at people, whatever way you're politically aligned, chat with the opposite person, get the perspective, and try and see, can you get this shared way, rather than it turning out to be like a polarizing shouting match, which can often be the case, especially around issues of sustainability and especially climate change. I suppose nothing additional to add, like to a takeaway or a call to action for the viewers watching today. I think the three previous panelists have really succinctly put it away. So Jelena mentioning the role of education, media, mentioning the role of culture, and understanding the arts, and really understanding the different prospects that you can get involved in sustainability. And then, as Eoin mentioned, I mean, chat with your local representatives, like ask them what they're doing, ask them to find out more, ask them to do more, be more, because ultimately that's where the responsibility is. So, and just to echo again, thanks very much for having us. Hope it was a good discussion for everybody.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody. Honestly, I have prepared some remarks while you were talking. I took some notes to close, but honestly, after hearing you, I don't think there is a need for me to say any more. And also, we're running over time anyway. But no, honestly, I find this one of the most inspiring discussions I have. I think in our discussion, somebody mentioned why youth have to be part of the table or on the table. Like this is the example why we need you, because you bring not only unwavering passion for this important global challenge, but also you bring innovative ideas, you bring activism, you bring hope. So thanks again to all the work that you do. Thanks for also being generous with your time and share your experiences with us today. On behalf of the conference, of the panelists, and myself, also, I would like to extend our thanks to the audience and their amazing questions and interactions online. Maybe before I close, one reminder about day 2, which is the next event. So the same time tomorrow, which is happening tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time. We have the second session on 25 years since the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, what's next? And it will be moderated by Lynette Fay. So this is a reminder to our audience to also tune in tomorrow for the next interesting session. With that, thanks all, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye.